My name is Diana, and I'm a friend and neighbor of Dia Abrams in Garner Valley, California. On June 6th of 2020, Dia Abrams disappeared from her Bonita Vista Ranch in Garner Valley, California. Dia and I first met through a mutual friend, and from that, our friendship grew. We found that we had so much in common. She's the older sister I never had.
I first met Dia Abrams in either 2010 or 2011, and throughout the years, it seemed like we ended up rescuing each other all the time. I had a really bad accident. She took care of me. She had a really gnarly back surgery, and I took care of her. Diana, Dia, and myself, we became good friends after that.
I can only describe Dia with one word, and that word is firecracker. She had a presence about her. Tomboy, but yet a girly girl. Loved her ranch, loved her animals. That was her pride and joy, were her animals. If there was a dog on the side of the road, she'd find a home for it.
Dia came out to this area, Mountain Center area, in the mid to late 90s. Her ranch is one of the most beautiful areas that you'll see.
Dia owns 3 properties in the Mountain Center area. One home was located on a 5-acre parcel in Garner Valley. Another residence was the Bonita Vista Ranch, which consisted of 116 acres. And then another piece of property called Sky High, which was about 20 acres. She resided between the Garner Valley house and the Bonita Vista Ranch.
I'm Jenny Kirshner, and I was a reporter and photographer for the Idlewild Town Crier newspaper. And when Dia went missing, it was probably the biggest story that I had worked on. Idlewild is a small mountain community in the mountains above Palm Springs, and it sits surrounded by the San Bernardino National Forest. It's a small population, it's about 4,000 people, and everybody definitely knows everybody.
It's a very tight-knit community. Everyone cares for one another. Dia, she is loved by everybody in the community.
Before she moved to Mountain Center, Dia married Clem Abrams. He was a wealthy real estate developer out of the San Diego area. Dia and Clem separated when she moved to Mountain Center, and he passed away in 2019.
Dia has 2 children, their son Clinton and her daughter Chrisara. Chrisara is a couple years older than Clinton.
I know that Dia loved her kids. I do. But I remember her telling me that she was disappointed in her children in that they could not make time for her. They had moved away to San Diego, and it baffled her that children would not have time for their mother.
Just because of how her children made her feel, I think she wanted an emotional partner. And then Harper came along.
My name is Keith Harper. I was born and raised in a little town in southern Idaho. Then I went into private industry, a recreational outfitting business out of Durango, Silverton, Ouray, Colorado. I met Dia in a dating site, and we had a 4-year relationship. When I actually met her, she picked me up in a Ford truck. I got in, and when I looked at her, I said, "Gosh, you are a country girl." And she said, "Why do you say that?" And I said, "Because you have hay in your hair." And she looked in the mirror and she said, "You know, I fed the horses before I came. I am so sorry." And I said, "No, that just proves to me who you are." I knew we had something special connected. I knew she needed help on the ranch, and I offered to come and actually work for her. And I fell deeply in love with her.
Dia had told me at one point that Harper had had a criminal past, but that he was not a criminal. But she was happy to have him there because he could help around the ranch. Harper, when he came around, I thought it was a good thing because it was help for Dia. But it was never really a romantic thing.
There was no affection between the two. Usually if you are involved in a relationship, you hold their hand or smile at them a certain way, or put your arm around them when you're sitting in a chair. It was lacking any type of physical emotion or activity with one another. So I didn't know if they were dating or not. And she goes, well, yeah, he is. He's more than a friend. And that was it. That's all I knew.
June 6, 2020. We were leaving the next day, Sunday. We were leaving for Colorado for the weekend. We've had some great trips where we went, and it all has to do with nature. And she was an enthusiast about that. Anyway, that was our plan. She had packed, we were packed. And I said, I'm going to go out and mow the meadow. I had stopped at around 2 o'clock. Had lunch with Dia. She said, have you got a minute? I need to talk with you. And I said, Dia, it's going to take me till dark to get the meadow done. I'm not that far into it. I need to get it done. And she said, oh, okay, it's not important. I wish I had that time to understand what she was going to tell me, because she felt it was fairly significant. I kind of discouraged that. I wished I hadn't done. I may have learned things about what she knew that she was willing to share at that moment, and I never get to do that chance again. I went back to mowing. By the time I got things squared away and came into the house, it was approximately 7 o'clock, so right at dark. And I went upstairs and I found her phone plugged in and no Dia. Her purse was sitting there. And I thought, I'm surprised she didn't take her purse. I went out back and I saw her truck there, and then the realization was she's got to be here somewhere. I was surprised that she wasn't there, but she had talked about going down to Lower Horse Ranch and going out and exercising the horses. So I thought, maybe that's what she does. She should be back shortly. It was almost 12:30 by the time I had finished any searching of the property. When I hadn't found her, I called the highway patrolman and expressed a concern, and he just said, nothing by morning, then get concerned. And so I didn't sleep much that night. I contacted the highway patrolman in the morning. He told me I needed to call the sheriff's office and report her as missing.
Sunday morning, June 7th, I received a phone call from Julie, and she asked me, has Harper called you? I said, no, why would Harper call me? So I call Harper. I said, what's going on? He goes, did Dia spend the night with you? I said, no. Well, I can't find her. I said, what do you mean? He goes, well, she was here Saturday. I saw her at lunch. I asked if he checked the Garner Valley house. He said, yes, she's not there. So I said, okay, I'm coming over.
Diana said, I'll be down there. I'll call some friends of Dia's. We'll do a search immediately of the ranch. My concern was where she was and what was going on with her. Maybe she had gone on a hike. Maybe she got injured. And so all that's going through my mind.
So we called everyone we could think of to come help and search the property. We all went to the Bonita Vista Ranch and met with Harper. Her truck is here, her keys to the truck are here, her purse is here, her cell phone is here. So things were not adding up. So Sunday night, there was no sign of her and it was getting dark. So we all decided to go home and start fresh early the next morning, like at 6 a.m. I started calling the police Monday morning, called Monday afternoon, and all the way up until they finally showed up on Monday night.
I said, you know, we've done an initial search of the property. And I said, you know, I was planning on leaving on Sunday. I have some business to take place in Colorado on Monday.
Harper said, I have to leave. I said, okay, why? He goes, well, I was involved in a circumstance. I'm on probation and I have to go back. I can't be here for more than a certain amount of days before I have to leave. And then I have to go check in with my probation officer. So I have to go check in with them. I didn't know what for. And I said, well, do you think that's such a good idea? But I used to be a probation officer. I know if I had a probationer call me and said, hey, look, my girlfriend is missing. I don't think it's a good idea if I leave. The probation officer, I'm sure, would say it was okay to do so.
The sheriff's office said they would be shutting the ranch down for the investigation. And I said, fine, you know, I have to be in Colorado, so I left.
On Monday, June 8th of 2020, Harper left the state. The community definitely had some red flags on why he would do that. There was no real answers on why he left.
By that time, Dia's son Clinton showed up. One of the neighbors had called him to say, hey, your mom's missing. I remember Clinton just kind of hanging out in the front. He never went searching. He never asked questions. He was just kind of hanging out with the crowd. Almost like he was searching for pity or something.
I never met Clinton, so I only saw a picture of him when he was younger on the refrigerator, and Dia would speak of him as being so smart that he was scary.
I remember once Dia looked me straight in the eye and said, if anything ever happens to me, my son Clinton did it.
I remember Dia told me that if anything happens to me, Clinton's going to have something to do with it. And I never forgot it because that's a big thing. You don't forget where you were when someone tells you something like that. Dia loved her children, but she did not get to see them very often. She said they want to do their own thing. She said she was hurt a lot by the inattention she got from them. She said they weren't always exactly kind. She ended up doing the reaching out. It wasn't the other way around. And in 10 years, I never met Clinton. I thought that was pretty odd.
She told me she had a constant conflict with Clinton on the phone, and to me, he always talked down to her. I never, ever heard Clinton call her mom. It was always Dia, as if he was talking down to her. And I remember being very angry about that, and I said, you cannot continue to let him talk to you that way.
She was disappointed because from what I understood from Dia was that the children were money hungry.
When Dia's husband, Clem, was alive, the two of them had an arrangement that he would pay for the bills at the ranch. Then when she got absolutely nothing from that will, she realized she had to do something.
So in 2019, Dia filed a petition to gain control of the estate that belonged to deceased Clem Abrams from her children. The estate is suspected to be worth about $15 to $30 million.
She said she was upset about having to go through the lawsuit with her kids, and she didn't like fighting with them. She was just disappointed in them.
I'm Matt Owens. I'm a lawyer. I'm a partner with the law firm in San Diego, California. I handle disputes involving trusts and estates, and I represent Dia's children. Dia was seeking to throw out or invalidate her prenuptial agreement that Dia had with Clem, her husband. as co-trustees of Clem's trust, her children had to oppose Dia's petition because just like any other trustee would have had to do the same thing in order to protect and honor what Clem had stated he wanted in the trust document. Dia's children were going to be fine regardless of who won or lost that lawsuit that Dia had filed. There was no potential outcome in that case where Dia's kids got nothing from Clem's trust. It was just a dispute over how much Dia was going to get during her lifetime and some other nuances, but her kids were going to be fine regardless of the outcome of that case.
The lawsuit for Clem Abrams' estate, I understand from Dia that Clinton had threatened Dia in taking away her truck as it was in Clem's trust. That was the heaviest thing on her mind before her disappearance, was they're gonna take my truck. What am I gonna do? They wouldn't even give me a ride home. Like, what am I supposed to do? I can't have transportation. Why do they need my truck?
The truck belonged to Clem's trust. And so if you're trustee of Clem's trust and there's an asset out there that belongs to the Clem Abrams trust, you kind of have to go get it. I don't think that there was any sort of desire to fight over, I think it was like a 2006 Ford truck, right? Like, I don't think there was a desire to achieve some sort of like financial benefit. It seemed like a trustee needing to go collect an asset that belonged to the trust.
That was the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak, when they were trying to take the truck away. Dia stated that she was cutting her kids out of her will. The reason for that is, why would you want to help people who were not willing to help you?
While Dia was in the middle of this court battle, fighting for that estate, she still had control over the 3 properties in the Idlewild area.
Dia Abrams owned those 3 properties that were completely separate and apart from the Clem Abrams Trust. They were Dia's properties.
About the same time, about March, I think it was, she had texted me and asked me, would you mind being the executor in my will? I'm thinking, this woman has at least 20 more years because she's in great shape, mentally just all there, and it's not going to be a thing. So I said, sure, no problem. She texted back, I'm trying to get Keith Harper to say yes to being executor as well.
Dia changed her trust, and that the children weren't to be allowed on the ranch. They had been basically disowned. She states their names, and she says, I leave you my love, which is worth more than anything else I have.
Dia changed her trust about 2 weeks, I think it was technically 15 days before she went missing. She did not reach out to her kids in that intervening 15 days and say, hey, I updated my trust, just want to let you know, okay? She did that basically in secrecy. I found it highly suspicious.
Dia, she feared extremely that her son would do something negative to her. A lot of the times she would express her concern for her welfare. She says, I do not feel safe anymore. I have challenged Clinton's efforts to control me and to shut me out of these fathers and trust.
So many things run through your head, but as far as I was concerned, he still had something to do with it. Not himself personally. I don't think he would ever touch his mom that way or hurt his mom physically, but he knew people that could or would, just based on Dia's statements.
Dia said once I'm worried. I said, I think he's got connections with mob people. And in my mind, I'm like, I don't want to hear this because that's dangerous. And I just said, be very careful and hope that that's not the truth.
It's ridiculous. I mean, it's just ridiculous to make that sort of allegation against him. Clinton has absolutely no ties with any sort of mafia, organized crime, whatever you want to call it.
once the Riverside County Sheriff's Department. We're done on Wednesday. They called Dia's kids and said, we're done with the investigation. You can go into the property. Even though we continuously told them, do not call the kids. Dia said that she did not want the children to ever go into her house. She was adamant about that. She goes, do not let my children in the house. All they care about are the things in the house, what they can take, what they can sell. It's all about money with them. So do not let them into the house. So I immediately spoke to Dia's attorney, and he obtained a copy of the power of attorney and a copy of the trust.
I remember Clinton coming up. It felt like standoff at the OK Corral. Clinton gets out of the truck. The lawyer comes out of another car. He walks up, and Diana's got the papers in hand.
And I said, I said, here's the paperwork from the attorney. Dia named me and Harper as executor to her will. Harper left the property. And I have power of attorney. Here's a document that says that I'm acting on Dia's behalf. And I made a promise to her that I would honor her wishes, take care of her property, not let her kids in the house. This is what I'm gonna do. We didn't realize at the time that it was about to get so much worse.
It's only been 5 days since Dia's been missing, but there is a lot of miscommunication and conflict when it comes to who actually owns the estate. Harper's left the state at this point, and Diana is on the property. So she's asked Clinton to leave, and there's still some debate over the issue of the truck.
I said, you can't leave with her property. This is Dia's truck. The one thing she asked that you do not take, her only vehicle. Dia hasn't been gone long. What if she came back? We need to find her. There was really no emotion coming from Clinton. If my mom was missing, I'd be yelling and screaming, going, where the heck is she? And that's when he said that the truck was part of his father's trust and that he's taking it. Who does that? It wasn't worth anything.
It's not like Dia didn't have assets, right? I mean, she had 3 properties. If she really needed a truck, is it really that big of a deal for her to get a different vehicle? I mean, I don't understand what the big deal was about the truck, other than certain people in the case have pointed to that as one instance where they're trying to spin it and make Clinton look like he was about to, do harm to their mother.
So there's obviously a lot of legal and financial conflict going on, but it's unclear how any of this kind of shows anything about why she disappeared. There really hasn't been any evidence to show that there was any foul play in the first place.
The next morning, we went out on our ATVs to search for Dia. Harper came home and he was able to start running things.
No one knows what happened to Dia. She's missing. She's disappeared.
So you start having a lot of thoughts run through your mind. Like, okay, what else could have happened? Would she have ran away because she had so much on her plate? Like, no, she wouldn't have ran away because she left her dog. She left all of her other animals. She left her phone, her driver's license, all of her credit cards, and a large sum of money behind. Doesn't make sense. Then we started thinking foul play.
Diana and I, we started to put together scenarios in our minds. A lot of things started clicking here and there about different persons and what they would have had to gain, specific actions that they would take or not take in the pursuit of finding Dia.
Weeks are going by, and Dia's still missing, but the Riverside County Sheriff's Department isn't commenting on the case at all.
Over time, Harper seemed to be more interested in the property and the ranch than he was in finding Dia.
I realized I didn't know anything about Harper's personality. I didn't know anything about his personal life. I didn't know him at all. And then the more we spoke, the more I realized some of the things that he was saying didn't make sense. I mean, he was the last one to see her. When we kept thinking, could he have really hurt her?
Keith Harper. This is not someone, as far as we could tell, who had any sort of significant wealth. After she goes missing, all of a sudden Harper finds himself in a great situation. He's living on this 115-acre ranch. His whole life changes. That's a big deal for someone in his situation. And then you contrast that with, what do the kids have to gain from Dia going missing? Very little. They're still going to be provided for under any scenario based on their father's wealth. But Keith Harper had a whole lot to gain by Dia going missing.
There is a lot of attention about me. I'm the primary suspect because I'm the boyfriend. What about the ranch? Did you kill her because you wanted the ranch? God, no. You know, I've worked on a ranch. Ranching does not make money. I know how to make money. I'm here because I loved a girl. When somebody asked me, did you kill her? I've had that question asked, but I said, honestly, you don't kill people you love. You kill people that you don't love.
We did work with a private investigator to do a criminal history check on Mr. Harper and learned some things that were pretty shocking to us. He had been convicted of sexual assault against 2 women in Colorado. So Mr. Harper ran some sort of business where he would take people around on a snowmobile. Based on the court records, he took these 2 women out on a snowmobile tour. They alleged that he groped both of them, and the authorities got involved, and he was arrested and ultimately convicted of sexual assault in connection with that event. That's what required him to be registered as a sex offender. He was sentenced to 12 months in jail for that conviction. I believe he served just short of 9 months.
As far as allegations, there is one allegation I have. It's the only conviction basically I have. I was wrongly accused of that allegation. It gets blown out of perspective, but I will tell you that I was not guilty of that charge. There's not much more I will say on that.
One of the things you definitely want to look at in that type of case is the nature of the relationship between Dia and the person who's now benefiting under the trust document, so Harper. Who is this Keith Harper guy? Was there foul play here? Did something nefarious happen?
You begin to wonder over and over again, how low in the barrel do you have to reach to point fingers? And I say the only reason the fingers are being pointed because it's pointed away for where they should look.
Dia Abrams was last seen June 6, 2020. If you have any information, please contact the Riverside County Sheriff's Department at 951-955-2400.
A few months after she was gone, Dia was gone, we were looking anywhere and everywhere for what could have possibly happened to Dia. And I know that the police were looking at Harper because he's the obvious suspect. I didn't want to believe it was Harper. I didn't want to believe it was their son, Clinton. To this point, I don't know where to cast suspicions.
To us, he was Harper. He was not really ruled out per se, but we don't know him.
I grew very fond of Dia and loved that girl. I can understand their concern. As her boyfriend, husbands, boyfriends are often the ones they look at, and most of the time, they're the ones involved in the situation. So I understood what was going on.
On March 16th of 2021, Dia's kids made a surprising move in court. So they filed a probate petition asking to remove Diana Fetter and Keith Harper as trustees of the estate. So the petition is saying that they think that Harper could be a suspect in this disappearance of Dia Abrams.
We were trying to get Keith Harper and Diana Federer out of that position as trustee. We wanted him out. They're not qualified to serve as trustee. Harper had been breaching fiduciary duties, meaning he had done things that were wrong under the law that were causing harm to Dia's trust.
There's a lot of false accusations in what they say. They're trying to point the finger. I mean, you just can't come in and just demand that the trust be changed. You have to have reasons why that change should occur.
We've learned that Harper started renting out multiple structures on that ranch, on Airbnb, weddings, all sorts of things that generated income. He was depositing into his personal bank account, so not in the name of Dia's trust, which, you know, any trust lawyer will tell you you cannot do. If you're a trustee and you're receiving rental income from a trust property, you have to put that money in a trust bank account, meaning a bank account that's set up in the name of Dia's trust.
I finally said, you know what, I'm done. I'm not doing this anymore. I didn't have the money to fight it or hire an attorney, so I'm removing myself as trustee of the estate.
Diana walked away from the case, so she agreed not to seek to serve in any fiduciary role.
So Dia's body hasn't been found, and really there's no evidence that anything even happened to her, except that she's missing. So a lot of finger pointing of he said, she said, but at the end of the day, she's still missing. So at this point, there's been no persons of interest that have been released by the Riverside County Sheriff's Department. There's still no clues. There's nothing that's being shared as far as evidence or suspects or anything. But Harper has a lot of things kind of working against him. There's definitely a lot of speculation on whether he's a suspect or not. I mean, the community is definitely unsure. It did really seem like he wanted to prove his innocence and kind of clear his name.
At that point, it's nearly a year has come and passed, so I contacted Kelly Snyder with a group out of Phoenix that comes in called the Find Me Organization.
The Find Me group work with law enforcement to try to connect families with their missing loved ones. They provide a lot of emotional support. They also use search and rescue and intuitive resources. When conventional methods of searching for people maybe doesn't turn up any clues, it's not really uncommon to try some unconventional methods like psychics. He works with approximately 100 psychics that helps, make some predictions about these missing people cases. Even though, Keith Harper might be sort of grasping at straws, it's not surprising that he would, try any methods he could to help find her.
When I talked to Kelly, I said, hey, I've lost a girlfriend. She's been gone almost a year now. I need your help. Is there some way you could put her on your agenda to look? He said, I've studied Dia's case. We're going to help you find her. So as a result of that, Kelly spends 6 weeks on the investigation. By the time he comes out, he basically says that he found her where she was. Kelly said the body's location was placed in Lake Hemet. I remember calling the detective at the sheriff's office. I said, you do have a dive team. He agreed. I would drive to the lake every day. The only dive that I see them actually do is the dive that goes on for about 20 minutes. They go out approximately 40 yards. You can see the bubbles where they go out. Then, when they had found nothing, I contacted Kelly. I was a little frustrated on why they had not found anything under his recommendation. I was pretty confident that they would, but she was not found then.
So at the end of the day, Dia's body wasn't found in Lake Hemet, and the Riverside County Sheriff's Department really didn't want to disclose any information about any evidence that might have been found. So, You know, it's important to kind of remember that these are sort of non-conventional methods to finding people. And so they claim they're only accurate about 30 to 35% of the time.
I have to be clear, I can't say that Keith Harper did it, right? I don't have that information. I don't have personal knowledge of that. All I can say is that his behavior after she went missing is highly suspect, and his history before she went missing is highly suspect. But we did achieve the settlement agreement.
I was working with Dia's attorney. He said, you know, what my recommendation is, you have a compromise with him. They're going to continue to come after you until you have nothing. I recommend that you settle with them, that you divide the property 50-50 and let the pieces fall. I agreed with that. The court, in their ruling, basically agreed to divide the property 50-50 with her children. If any one of us are found to be guilty, they are to receive nothing until such time as the 5-year mark is passed, or if Dia is located and determined to be dead. As a result of that, that's where we're currently in, the status of determining what the status is and what the ruling of the court really means. At least the main litigations are done for now.
To me, the judge made the only decision he could in this matter. I don't see how he could make a different decision at this time to be fair to either party.
It's been almost 3 years now. And so I feel like I failed her. And the not knowing drives me crazy. Her friends are just dumbfounded. Not a day goes by that I don't think of her. Not a day.
To everybody out here watching this, any information you have, please call the sheriff's department. If you know anything and you see what's going on here, what this poor lady had to go through, please help.
We're looking for information from anyone who might know what happened to Dia. We have information about some sort of foul play where someone perhaps abducted her, or even worse. That's the type of information we're looking for. Do you know the whereabouts of where her remains might be, if that's the situation? Those are the types of things that we're looking for. Clinton wants a reward posted because he wants people to come forward with information as to what happened to Dia. So if anyone comes forward with information leading to some sort of criminal charge or criminal conviction, then you're going to be able to collect on a $300,000 reward.
I want this to be over. I want to have some kind of conclusion. I think we're close enough now that her case will move forward. I'm very hopeful of that. It's interesting. I don't think you really evaluate how important a relationship is until you lose it. And once you have lost it, then you realize how significant that relationship was and what it meant to you when she was present.
If I could see Dia again, I would just give her a big hug and cry and just be so happy to see her. And then I'd be like, darn you for disappearing like that. Darn it, darn it. I would just want to say everything's going to be okay. But if she's not here and she's in heaven, I know that someday I'll see her there. I know I'll see her again. And that gives me comfort.
The last thing anyone heard was a screen door slamming against the dry desert wind. It was just after 9:17 p.m. on a dry September night in 2001 when Daniel Mercer stepped out of his small stucco house on the edge of town, phone still glowing in his hand, voice tight, words clipped. A neighbor would later say it sounded like an argument. Another swore he heard Daniel say, "I'm done running." And then, nothing. No engine turning over. No footsteps on gravel. No second phone call. Just the hollow rush of wind rolling in from the open desert, pushing dust across driveways and rattling loose gutters like nervous fingers tapping metal. By morning, Daniel Mercer was gone. No note. No forced entry. No blood. No wallet on the kitchen counter. No sign of a struggle. His truck sat in the driveway, keys still inside. His coffee mug rested half full on the table. The television hummed to an empty room. It was as if the night had swallowed him whole and sealed its mouth shut. Daniel was 32. A mechanic. Quiet, steady, the kind of man who fixed neighbors' cars without charging them. He lived alone on the outskirts of a growing Arizona town where subdivisions were still fighting the desert for space. He had no criminal record. No known enemies. No recent breakups dramatic enough to make headlines. Just a routine life carved between heat and horizon. But routine shattered fast. When Daniel didn't show up for work the next morning, his boss called. When he didn't answer, his sister drove over. By noon, police were walking through the house, squinting at undisturbed furniture and untouched mail. Detectives noted the sliding door slightly ajar, curtains fluttering inward. They dusted for prints. They bagged the phone charger still plugged into the wall. They searched the backyard for disturbed soil. Nothing. By sunset, search teams fanned out into the desert. Helicopters skimmed low over cacti and dry riverbeds. Volunteers formed lines, boots crunching over brittle brush. They called his name into empty space. Their voices vanished into heat waves rising off the sand. No footprints leading away from the house. No drag marks. No tire tracks beyond his own driveway. It was as if Daniel had stepped into air and dissolved. Within days, headlines hit local papers. Arizona man vanishes without trace. The community buzzed with theories. Drug deal gone wrong. Secret double life. Voluntary disappearance. But detectives quickly ruled out the easy narratives. Daniel's bank account hadn't been touched. His phone records showed nothing unusual beyond that final call, an outgoing number registered to a prepaid cell phone that went dark immediately after. The call lasted 34 seconds. 34 seconds that investigators would replay over and over, straining to capture background noise. A car door. Wind. Another voice. All they heard was Daniel saying, "Where are you?" followed by static, and then the abrupt end of connection. The prepaid number was a dead end. Purchased with cash at a convenience store 60 miles away. No cameras preserved the sale. No clerk remembered the face. In 2001, surveillance technology was grainy at best, non-existent at worst. The trail evaporated as quickly as it formed. Weeks turned into months. Posters faded in the sun. Volunteers thinned out. Detectives knocked on doors until knuckles bruised. They interviewed co-workers, neighbors, former girlfriends. They searched abandoned wells and drainage culverts. They brought in cadaver dogs. The dogs found nothing. And then the whispers began. A rancher claimed he saw a dark sedan idling near Daniel's property the night he vanished. Another resident reported headlights cutting through a dirt path not typically used. But memory is a fragile thing, especially when shaped by fear and rumor. By the time statements were taken, details blurred. Dark sedan became black truck. 2 headlights became 1. The case cooled faster than anyone wanted to admit. Cold case is a clinical phrase. It sounds organized, controlled. In reality, It feels like failure sealed in a cardboard box. Daniel's file grew thicker, then heavier, then dustier. Detectives rotated out. New cases demanded attention. Homicides with bodies. Assaults with suspects. Crimes that screamed instead of whispered. But Daniel's disappearance whispered. His sister, Laura, refused to let it fade. Every year on the anniversary, she held a vigil outside his house, candles trembling in paper cups. She spoke to reporters. She begged for information. She said, "Someone knows something." It became her refrain. Someone knows something. The house eventually sold. New owners painted the walls. They replaced the screen door. But neighbors swore the place felt wrong at night. Lights flickered. Dogs barked toward the desert for no reason. Stories layered over facts, thickening the air around the property. 5 years passed. Then 8. In 2009, investigators reopened the file briefly after a hiker discovered a partial human bone nearly 40 miles from Daniel's home. Forensics determined it belonged to a woman decades older. Another dead end. Another spike of hope flattened into silence. By 2011, Daniel Mercer's name lived mostly online, forums dedicated to missing persons, amateur sleuths mapping desert terrain, strangers analyzing his final phone call like a cryptic puzzle. Some believed he staged his disappearance. Others insisted it was a targeted abduction. A few speculated about serial predators moving through rural counties undetected. Detectives had one fact they couldn't shake: Daniel left voluntarily that night. There was no sign of forced removal. He walked out under his own power. The question was why. In 2014, technology advanced. Phone data extraction improved. Analysts re-examined tower pings from Daniel's cell phone. The last signal placed him within a half-mile radius of his home. It never moved beyond that zone. The phone either powered off or was destroyed within minutes of that final call. Ground-penetrating radar scanned portions of nearby desert. Nothing significant. Excavations near a dry wash yielded animal bones and rusted farm equipment. Laura aged in front of cameras. Her voice grew firmer, then hoarser. She insisted Daniel was not the type to run. She described his laugh, the way he chewed on pens when concentrating, the way he always locked doors twice. He wouldn't just vanish, she said. He wouldn't leave me. But vanishing was exactly what happened. In 2017, a former co-worker came forward with a story he'd kept buried. He claimed Daniel had confided in him weeks before the disappearance, mentioning someone pressuring him over money. The co-worker couldn't provide a name. He didn't know if it was gambling debt or a private loan. He admitted he hadn't taken it seriously at the time. Investigators chased financial records again. No unusual withdrawals. No massive debts. But cash transactions leave faint shadows. If Daniel owed someone under the table, paper wouldn't show it. They re-interviewed acquaintances. Most had moved away. Memories had eroded. A few insisted Daniel had seemed distracted in his final days. Others said he appeared completely normal. Human recollection is a hall of mirrors, every reflection slightly warped. The case entered its 17th year. Then, something shifted. In late 2018, construction crews broke ground for a new housing development less than 3 miles from Daniel's former home. Bulldozers scraped through earth that had sat untouched for decades. On a cool November morning, a machine operator noticed fabric protruding from a shallow depression. He assumed it was trash, an old tarp, maybe discarded clothing. It wasn't trash. Police sealed the site within hours. Yellow tape fluttered against unfinished foundations. Workers stood in stunned silence as forensic teams knelt in the dirt. They uncovered a weathered jacket. Inside the pocket, a driver's license, sun-bleached, cracked, but legible. Daniel Mercer. The desert had kept its secret for 17 years. The body was incomplete, skeletal remains scattered by time and animals. There was no immediate sign of cause of death. No obvious trauma visible on first inspection. Just bones arranged in a way that suggested he hadn't been buried deep. Almost placed. Almost hidden, but not carefully. The discovery detonated through the community. News vans lined the street again. Laura collapsed into tears on live television. Detectives who had long since retired were called for comment. "We never stopped caring," one said, eyes downcast. But caring and solving are not the same thing. Forensic analysis began. Soil samples. Fiber fragments. Microscopic traces. They searched for bullet fragments, knife marks, fractures consistent with blunt force. Weeks passed before preliminary findings emerged. There were fractures. Subtle. Hairline cracks along the ribcage inconsistent with animal scavenging. A small, depressed fracture at the base of the skull. Not definitive proof of homicide, but strongly suggestive. The medical examiner ruled the manner of death undetermined, suspicious. Suspicious. 17 years, and the case moved from missing person to possible homicide in a single press conference. Investigators combed through old evidence with renewed urgency. The prepaid phone number resurfaced as a critical thread. Could modern data analysis uncover what 2001 technology could not? Could purchasing patterns, cell tower mapping, forgotten transaction logs finally illuminate the faceless voice on the other end of that 34-second call? Laura stood before microphones again, older now, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. "He didn't leave," she said. "Someone took him. Someone put him there." The desert stretched silent behind the crime scene tape, indifferent as ever. 17 years earlier, a screen door had slammed against the wind. Now the wind carried something else, answers inching closer, or perhaps just the illusion of them. Because finding a body is not the same as finding truth. Anna's detectives reopened interviews, re-examined alibis, and pulled aging evidence from climate-controlled lockers. One question echoed louder than ever. If Daniel Mercer walked out of his house alive that night, who was waiting for him in the dark? The desert does not give back what it takes without a price. When Daniel Mercer's remains surfaced beneath the blade of a bulldozer, the case did not simply reopen, it detonated. Detectives, who had long ago boxed up the file, now found themselves staring at photographs of bone fragments laid out under fluorescent light, each fracture a whisper from 17 silent years. The depressed fracture at the base of the skull became the focal point. Forensic anthropologists leaned over magnified images, debating angles, force, object type. Not an animal bite. Not environmental erosion. Something deliberate. Something human. The tone shifted overnight. Missing person became suspected homicide. An homicide demands a killer. Investigators rebuilt the final timeline with obsessive precision. September 14, 2001. Daniel leaves work at 6:12 p.m. Stops at a gas station at 6:34. Pays cash. Camera footage long erased. Arrives home at 7:02. A neighbor sees his porch light flick on at 8:47. The outgoing call at 9:17. 34 seconds. Then silence. But the new question was no longer where Daniel went. It was who brought him to that shallow grave, less than 3 miles from his front door. The burial site wasn't random. It sat on land owned in 2001 by a private investment group that had since dissolved. Back then, it was scrub, open, unmonitored, accessible by a narrow dirt access road branching off a poorly lit highway. Detectives revisited old maps, overlaying satellite imagery from the early 2000s. The access road had existed then. It would have taken less than 7 minutes by car from Daniel's house. 7 minutes. Close enough to move a body quickly. Far enough to feel isolated. So investigators turned back to the people within that radius. They re-interviewed the rancher, who once reported a dark sedan idling near Daniel's home. Now in his 70s, his memory wavered, but one detail held steady. He remembered brake lights glowing red against the dust. Parked. Waiting. He had assumed it was a visitor. Didn't think nothing of it, he said. Out there, folks mind their business. Another neighbor, who had dismissed the headlights she saw cutting through a dirt path that night, now felt the weight of hindsight. She described the vehicle again, low profile, maybe a sedan, maybe dark blue. She heard no gunshot. No scream. Just wind. Wind can swallow a lot. Investigators subpoenaed old vehicle registrations within a 5-mile radius from 2001. Hundreds of names resurfaced. Some owners had died. Some had moved states away. Detectives started knocking on doors again, this time armed with the knowledge that Daniel hadn't simply wandered off. One name began to flicker through interviews with uncomfortable frequency: Eric Halden. Eric had worked at the same auto shop as Daniel until mid-2001. They weren't close friends, but they shared shifts. Eric had left abruptly after a dispute with management. Rumors at the time suggested missing cash from a parts inventory fund, though no charges were filed. Back then, detectives had spoken to him briefly. He claimed he and Daniel barely interacted. But in 2017, the co-worker who mentioned Daniel feeling pressured over money described the person vaguely, mid-30s, temperamental, drove a dark sedan, had recently borrowed cash from multiple employees. Eric Halden matched that description. In 2001, Eric owned a navy blue 1998 Toyota Camry. Records showed he sold the car 3 weeks after Daniel vanished. When investigators located Eric in 2018, he was living 2 counties away, working construction. He agreed to speak voluntarily. He appeared calm, cooperative, slightly irritated by what he called old ghosts. He denied pressuring Daniel, denied borrowing significant money, admitted they had argued once about a misdiagnosed engine repair, but insisted it was minor. When asked about the night of September 14, 2001, he paused. 17 years is a long time to recall a random Friday. He claimed he was home watching television. Alone. No alibi beyond his own word. Detectives pressed about the prepaid phone. He shrugged. Everybody used those back then, he said. Hardly proof of anything. But technology had evolved. Digital forensic analysts revisited cell tower data not just from Daniel's phone, but from every active device pinging off the nearest towers between 8:30 and 10 p.m. that night. In 2001, records were crude, but partial logs remained archived by the carrier. Thousands of numbers. Most unidentifiable after nearly 2 decades. Except one prepaid number. The same number Daniel had called at 9:17 p.m. Cross-referenced against tower range, that prepaid phone had pinged within a 1-mile radius of Daniel's home earlier that evening. Then, at 9:26 p.m., it connected briefly to a tower closer to the eventual burial site. 9 minutes after the final call. 9 minutes. Enough time for a meeting to turn violent. For a body to be moved. For a phone to power off forever. Investigators dug deeper into Eric Halden's financial records from 2001. Bank statements were sparse, but one detail surfaced. 3 days before Daniel disappeared, Eric withdrew $500 in cash. 2 days after the disappearance, he deposited $1,200. The source of the deposit remained unclear. No direct transfer from Daniel's account. But Daniel was known to keep cash at home for side repair jobs. Was it coincidence? Or motive? Laura Mercer watched from the sidelines as Eric's name leaked to local media. The community buzz returned, louder now, sharpened by outrage. Social media labeled him a killer before charges were ever filed. But suspicion is not proof. Detectives sought forensic links. They tracked down the Toyota Camry's new owner from 2001. The vehicle had long since been scrapped. No physical evidence remained. They searched Eric's former residence, now occupied by another family. Nothing preserved from that era. Time had eroded the scene almost as thoroughly as the desert. Then came a breakthrough no one expected. A retired detective, cleaning out storage from the original investigation, found an overlooked evidence bag. Inside, soil scraped from the sole of Daniel's work boots, collected during the initial house search, but never analyzed in depth. In 2001, resources were limited. The sample had been logged and forgotten. Modern forensic geology changed that. Scientists compared the soil from Daniel's boots to samples taken from the burial site. The mineral composition aligned, high concentrations of caliche, and distinct quartz fragments unique to that specific patch of desert. Daniel had been at that location before he died. Not dragged there unconscious. Not transported later. He had walked on that soil while alive. The implication tightened the timeline. He met someone willingly. Traveled, likely by car, to that remote area. Stepped out. And sometime shortly after, suffered a fatal blow to the head. Investigators brought Eric Halden back in for questioning. This time, the room felt different. They laid out the tower pings. The timing. The soil match. The financial discrepancies. They mentioned witnesses recalling a dark sedan near Daniel's house. Eric's composure flickered. He maintained his innocence, but his answers shifted subtly. He now admitted Daniel had loaned him a few $100s months earlier. He denied meeting him that night. Denied owning a prepaid phone. Denied being near the desert property. But when confronted with the tower data placing the prepaid phone moving from Daniel's neighborhood toward the burial site, within minutes of the call, Eric asked a question that froze the room. How accurate are those towers, really? Not, I wasn't there. Not, that's impossible. Just a technical challenge. Investigators noted the change. Still, there was no direct evidence tying Eric to the prepaid phone. It had been purchased with cash. No fingerprints preserved. No DNA swabs taken at the time. The phone itself was never recovered. The case balanced on circumstantial threads, strong threads, but threads nonetheless. Meanwhile, forensic reanalysis of Daniel's skull fracture suggested a blunt object approximately 2 inches wide. Possibly a tire iron. Possibly a metal tool. Eric had worked as a mechanic. The detail felt heavy. Search warrants were executed on Eric's current property. Tools were collected. Old storage bins opened. Nothing conclusively linked back to 2001. After 17 years, metal rusts, objects disappear, memories distort. But pressure builds in strange ways. As media coverage intensified, a former acquaintance of Eric contacted detectives anonymously. She claimed that weeks after Daniel vanished, Eric had shown up at a bar intoxicated, ranting about being owed respect and how people who cross you disappear. At the time, she dismissed it as drunken bravado. Now it sounded different. Investigators tracked her down formally. She stood by her statement, but admitted she had no direct knowledge of a crime. Just words. Angry, vague words. Still, patterns began to form. Debt. Argument. Meeting. Remote location. Blunt force trauma. Shallow grave. But one critical question lingered like heat over asphalt. If Eric killed Daniel, why meet so close to home? Why bury him so shallow? Why risk it? Unless it wasn't planned. Unless that 34-second call was a confrontation spiraling out of control. Reenactment specialists mapped the likely sequence. Daniel receives a call or message earlier that evening. Agrees to meet. Walks outside. Gets into a familiar vehicle, no struggle. They drive the short distance. An argument escalates. A tool within reach becomes a weapon. One blow. Maybe two. Panic. Shallow burial under darkness. Phone destroyed. Car cleaned. Life resumes. Simple. Too simple. Because in 2001, no one reported seeing two men arguing in the desert. No neighbors heard raised voices. No tire tracks were documented at the burial site during initial searches. And yet, Daniel's bones lay there. In 2019, the county prosecutor announced the case was actively under review. A grand jury convened quietly. Eric Halden hired an attorney. Laura Mercer waited, heart suspended between hope and dread. 17 years of silence had cracked open. The desert had yielded its dead. The timeline was tightening. The pressure mounting. But as investigators prepared to present their findings, another question began to surface, one that threatened to fracture the case entirely. What if Eric Halden wasn't the only one who met Daniel Mercer that night? Doubt crept in quietly, like sand slipping under a closed door. Just when investigators believed the case was narrowing, tightening around Eric Halden like a vice, a new anomaly surfaced, small, technical, almost invisible. But in cold cases, it's the nearly invisible details that rupture everything. The prepaid phone, the ghost in this entire story, had pinged twice that night. Not once. The first ping, at 8:52 p.m., placed it within a mile of Daniel's house. The second, at 9:26 p.m., closer to the burial site. That much investigators already knew. But advanced tower reanalysis, using updated triangulation modeling unavailable in 2001, revealed something subtle about that second ping. It wasn't stationary. It was moving. The data suggested the phone was traveling northbound at approximately 40 to 45 miles per hour when it connected to the tower, consistent with highway speed, not with a vehicle stopped on a dirt access road burying a body. Which meant one of two things. Either Daniel was killed immediately upon arrival and buried in near darkness in under 2 minutes, a near impossible feat. Or the prepaid phone was not at the burial site when it pinged that second tower. Which meant someone else had it. The room went quiet when analysts presented the model. Detectives leaned back in their chairs. The timeline they had reconstructed so carefully began to shift under their feet. If Eric met Daniel, and if an argument turned violent, and if Daniel died near that shallow grave, then who was driving northbound at highway speed 9 minutes later with the prepaid phone still active? Unless the meeting wasn't between two men. Unless there were three. Investigators reopened interviews yet again, this time with a different lens. Who else had motive? Who else had connection to both Daniel and Eric? Who else had reason to use an untraceable prepaid device? A name that had hovered quietly in the original 2001 file resurfaced: Marissa Cole. Marissa had dated Daniel briefly earlier that year. The relationship ended abruptly. Friends described it as intense, volatile. She had also, according to co-worker gossip at the time, been seen socializing with Eric Halden after her breakup with Daniel. Back in 2001, detectives asked her standard questions. She claimed she hadn't spoken to Daniel in months. She denied any lingering tension. Her alibi for the night of September 14th was simple: home alone. No one had challenged it deeply. At the time, she wasn't considered central. Now she was. In 2018, Marissa was living out of state. Married. 2 children. A stable suburban life. When detectives contacted her for a follow-up interview, her initial response was cautious but cooperative. She sounded surprised the case had resurfaced so forcefully. But during questioning, small inconsistencies emerged. She first stated she hadn't seen Eric in years by the time Daniel disappeared. Phone records from 2001, limited but preserved, showed multiple calls between her landline and Eric's apartment in August of that year. She then corrected herself. "We were just friends," she said. "It wasn't serious." Investigators asked if she knew Daniel kept cash at home for side jobs. She hesitated. "Everyone knew that," she replied. Not everyone did. Then came the pivotal question. Did you ever own or use a prepaid cell phone in 2001? She blinked. There it was, the first visible crack. A pause just a fraction too long. "I don't think so," she answered. "Why would I?" Why indeed? Records showed that in late August 2001, a convenience store 60 miles away, where the prepaid phone linked to Daniel's final call was purchased, also processed a separate transaction minutes earlier on the same register. That transaction was paid with a debit card belonging to a Marissa Cole. 17 years earlier, surveillance footage hadn't been preserved. But digital transaction logs had. The purchases were separated by 4 minutes. 4 minutes between a snack and a soda purchased with Marissa's debit card and a prepaid phone purchased with cash. Detectives didn't accuse her outright. Not yet. But the probability tightened like a fist. When confronted with the transaction log, Marissa's explanation shifted again. She admitted she had stopped at that convenience store during a road trip around that time, but denied purchasing a phone. She suggested someone else in line could have made the cash transaction. Possible. But unlikely. Investigators turned their focus to the dynamic between Daniel, Eric, and Marissa in the weeks before the disappearance. Co-workers began recalling tension, not just financial pressure, but jealousy. Daniel had reportedly accused Eric of interfering in his relationship. A heated exchange in the auto shop parking lot weeks before Daniel vanished had drawn attention. At the time, it was dismissed as typical post-breakup drama. Now it looked different. What if the 34-second call wasn't about money? What if it was about her? Phone analysis revealed something else buried in archived billing metadata. The prepaid number had attempted to call Daniel twice earlier that evening before he returned the call at 9:17 p.m. 2 missed calls. Daniel chose to call back, which suggested familiarity. Recognition. He knew, or believed he knew, who was on the other end. Investigators reconstructed a new possible sequence. Marissa acquires a prepaid phone, untraceable. She contacts Daniel under the guise of closure. Perhaps reconciliation. He agrees to meet. But she isn't alone. Eric is there too. Emotions escalate. Words turn sharp. Old resentment resurfaces. A confrontation spirals. But if that were true, who struck the fatal blow? Forensic pathology re-examined the skull fracture under high-resolution imaging. The angle suggested the blow came from behind and slightly above. Not during a face-to-face argument. More like an ambush. One strike, delivered with force. Daniel collapses. Panic ignites. Now the timeline splits. Perhaps Eric remains at the scene. Perhaps Marissa takes the prepaid phone and drives northbound to dispose of it, explaining the moving tower ping at 9:26 p.m. highway speed. Phone active. Then powered off permanently miles away. Search teams in 2001 had focused south and west of Daniel's home. They had never thoroughly searched northbound highway shoulders for discarded electronics. If the phone was thrown from a moving vehicle into desert brush at 45 miles per hour, it would have vanished without a trace. The theory aligned disturbingly well. Investigators pressed Marissa harder in a second interview. She denied meeting Daniel that night. Denied seeing Eric. Denied owning the prepaid phone. But when asked if she still communicated with Eric after Daniel disappeared, she admitted they had spoken a few times. Phone records showed more than a few. Over 20 calls in the month following Daniel's disappearance. Why would two casual acquaintances speak that frequently after a mutual co-worker vanished? When confronted, she claimed they were discussing how crazy the situation was. Offering each other support. Meanwhile, detectives re-interviewed Eric Halden once more, this time presenting the convenience store transaction linked to Marissa. His reaction was subtle but unmistakable, a tightening jaw, a flicker in his eyes. He insisted he had nothing to do with any prepaid phone. But when asked if Marissa might have had one, he responded too quickly. I wouldn't know. Wouldn't know. Not didn't know. The case that once seemed to orbit solely around Eric was widening into something more complex, more calculated. Two people. A shared secret. 17 years of silence. In early 2020, prosecutors weighed conspiracy charges. Not just homicide, but coordinated action after the fact. Yet they still lacked a confession. Lacked the murder weapon. Lacked DNA placing either suspect definitively at the burial site. Circumstantial evidence can build a wall. But without one brick of undeniable proof, it can crumble. Laura Mercer watched as hope surged again, then stalled. She had spent nearly 2 decades imagining a faceless predator. Now she faced the possibility that Daniel walked willingly into a meeting with someone he once loved and someone he once trusted. Betrayal cuts deeper than violence. Investigators returned to the burial site one more time, scanning with enhanced ground-penetrating radar beyond the immediate grave. They searched for metallic signatures. For discarded objects buried deeper than Daniel's shallow resting place. Days passed. On the 4th day, the radar hit something. Small. Dense. Metallic. Approximately 12 feet east of where Daniel's remains had been found. Careful excavation began. And as the soil peeled back layer by layer, something long and rusted began to emerge from the desert floor. The object came out of the earth slowly, as if the desert were reluctant to surrender it. 12 feet east of Daniel Mercer's shallow grave, buried deeper than the bones, but not deep enough to escape detection forever, lay a rusted length of metal wrapped in what had once been cloth. Forensic technicians brushed away compacted caliche inch by inch. The shape sharpened. Cylindrical. Heavy. One end slightly flattened. A tire iron. Time had eaten at the surface, but the weight of it was undeniable. When lifted from the soil, flakes of rust fell like brittle ash. The cloth around it, degraded, nearly fused to the metal, appeared to be part of a mechanic's shop rag. Blue fibers still clung faintly in protected creases. Daniel had been struck by a blunt object approximately 2 inches wide. This was 2 inches wide. The air around the dig site felt charged, electric. Detectives didn't speak. They didn't need to. The desert had just coughed up something that should have ended this case 17 years ago. The tire iron was sealed and rushed to the lab. Rust complicates everything. DNA degrades. Fingerprints dissolve. But sometimes, in the quietest crevices, under a fold of fabric, beneath corrosion, microscopic traces survive. Forensic analysts worked under magnification for days, isolating fibers, scraping particulate matter, swabbing for touch DNA. And then came the first result. Partial DNA. Not enough for a full profile. But enough for comparison. The partial matched Daniel Mercer. Blood. 17 years later, microscopic fragments of his blood still clung to oxidized metal. Cause of death shifted from undetermined, suspicious to homicide. Blunt force trauma consistent with the recovered weapon. The community reaction was immediate and visceral. News outlets no longer framed it as a disappearance. It was murder. Cold-blooded. Sealed in desert soil. But the weapon alone didn't answer the most critical question. Whose hands had swung it? Analysts continued processing the cloth remnants wrapped around the tire iron. Blue fibers were compared to uniforms from the auto shop where Daniel and Eric once worked. In 2001, the shop issued standardized navy blue cotton rags for cleaning grease and oil. Records confirmed it. Investigators obtained archived supply invoices. Same brand. Same material composition. The fiber weave matched. The cloth likely originated from that shop. That narrowed the circle dramatically. Detectives brought Eric Halden in again, this time not for a voluntary chat. The interview room lights buzzed faintly overhead. A photograph of the rusted tire iron lay on the table between them. Eric stared at it longer than necessary. "We found it near Daniel," a detective said evenly. "Buried." Eric swallowed. He denied ever being at that desert property. Denied owning that specific tool. But mechanics accumulate tools the way writers accumulate words, by habit, by necessity. Over years, inventory blurs. "Can you account for every tire iron you owned in 2001? The detective asked. Silence. Eric leaned back, arms crossed. "That could be anybody's," he muttered. True. But not everyone had motive. Not everyone had a dark sedan seen idling that night. Not everyone had unexplained deposits days after Daniel vanished. Investigators shifted focus to Marissa Cole once more. When informed that a murder weapon had been recovered, her composure cracked more visibly than before. Her breathing quickened. She asked whether her name had been mentioned publicly. She asked whether her children would find out. Fear doesn't equal guilt. But it speaks. Detectives confronted her with the convenience store transaction again, this time alongside the tower data and the recovered weapon. They laid out the new reconstruction, prepaid phone purchased minutes after her debit card transaction. Phone used to contact Daniel. Meeting arranged. Eric present. Tire iron from the shop. Burial close to town. Phone disposed northbound. Marissa's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't kill him," she whispered. "Not I wasn't there. Not I don't know what happened. I didn't kill him." The phrasing hung heavy. Who did? A detective asked softly. She shook her head. I never thought it would go that far. Go that far. The first fracture in 17 years of denial. But when pressed further, she retreated. Requested an attorney. The interview ended. Investigators now had a weapon. A partial DNA match to the victim. Fiber links to the shared workplace. Financial irregularities. Tower data suggesting coordinated movement. And a statement implying knowledge of escalation. What they did not yet have was a confession, or definitive DNA tying either suspect to the tire iron. Touch DNA extraction continued. Rust complicates recovery, but modern low copper number analysis sometimes reveals what time tries to erase. Days stretched. Then the lab called. A second partial profile had been isolated from the inner fold of the cloth wrapped around the tire iron. Degraded. Fragmented. But containing enough markers for comparison. It did not match Daniel. It did not match any unknown profile in CODIS. But when compared to a fresh voluntary sample obtained from Eric Halden during questioning, the markers aligned. Not a perfect profile, but statistically significant. Eric's attorney immediately challenged the validity, degradation, contamination, chain of custody. 17 years between crime and recovery provides ample ground for doubt. Yet the alignment was there. Investigators obtained a warrant for Eric's arrest on suspicion of second-degree murder. The news hit like thunder. Eric was taken into custody at his construction site, wrists cuffed under a sky as mercilessly clear as it had been in 2001. He maintained his innocence as cameras flashed. I didn't kill anybody, he shouted. They're twisting this. But the case was no longer whispers and theories. It was physical. Tangible. Metal and bone and microscopic trace. Still, one question pulsed beneath everything. Where did Marissa fit? Because even if Eric delivered the blow, evidence suggested coordination. The prepaid phone. The northbound ping. The post-disappearance calls between them. Prosecutors convened a grand jury. Behind closed doors, investigators presented the full timeline. The weapon. The soil match proving Daniel walked to that site alive. The prepaid phone purchased minutes after Marissa's debit transaction. The tower movement northbound. The partial DNA linking Eric to the cloth. And then they introduced one more piece. In 2001, 2 days after Daniel disappeared, Marissa had called Eric at 2:13 a.m. The call lasted 18 minutes. 18 minutes in the dead of night. Back then, it meant nothing. Now it sounded like aftermath. When subpoenaed for testimony before the grand jury, Marissa was offered limited immunity for cooperation, protection from certain charges, if she provided truthful information about what happened that night. For the first time in 17 years, she faced a choice between silence and survival. Outside the courthouse, Laura Mercer stood with trembling hands, watching the doors through which witnesses disappeared. Her brother's face stared from a poster she still carried, edges worn soft by time. 17 years of not knowing. 17 years of imagining Desert Wind as the only witness. Now the desert had spoken. A rusted tire iron lay in an evidence locker. A man sat in jail. And a woman weighed how much truth she was willing to trade for freedom. Because cold cases don't thaw gently. They fracture. And when they fracture, buried loyalties crack open too. The pressure inside a sealed room builds quietly before it explodes. Marissa Cole sat before the grand jury with her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles blanched white. 17 years of silence pressed against her ribs. Outside, cameras waited. Inside, 12 strangers waited. And somewhere between memory and fear, the truth hovered, raw and volatile. She had been offered limited immunity. Not full protection. Not absolution. Just enough to step out of the blast radius, if she chose her words carefully. The prosecutor's voice was steady. Calm. Clinical. Tell us about September 14, 2001. For a moment, Marissa said nothing. The air felt thin. Then she exhaled, and the dam cracked. She admitted she bought the prepaid phone. Not for business. Not for convenience. For secrecy. She said Daniel wouldn't answer her regular calls anymore. He had cut her off after a volatile breakup. He accused her of seeing Eric behind his back. She claimed she only wanted closure. To clear the air. But she also admitted she had told Eric about the meeting. I didn't think, she began, then stopped. Didn't think what? She described calling Daniel twice that evening. He didn't pick up. When he finally returned the call at 9:17 p.m., she told him she needed to see him. Just talk. Just 5 minutes. She suggested the dirt lot off the highway, neutral ground, she said. Not his house. Not hers. The burial site. According to her testimony, she arrived first. Eric arrived separately. Daniel pulled in minutes later, confused but not alarmed. The argument started almost immediately. Accusations. Money owed. Betrayal. She described Daniel stepping out of his truck, pacing, angry but not violent. She said Eric's temper flared fast. Words escalated. Insults sharpened. Daniel allegedly shoved Eric once, hard enough to make him stumble back. And then, she said, Eric grabbed the tire iron from his trunk. The grand jury room went still. She claimed she screamed at him to put it down. Claimed she thought he was bluffing. Claimed she never believed he would swing. But he did. One strike to the back of Daniel's head. Daniel collapsed face first into the dirt. No second blow. Just one. She described the sound, not loud, not cinematic. A dull, sickening crack swallowed by open desert. Daniel didn't move again. Eric panicked, she said. He dropped to his knees, shaking Daniel, shouting his name. There was blood, more than she expected. She insisted she wanted to call 911. Eric refused. He told her if they called police, they were both finished. Her involvement. The secret phone. The lie. Fear does strange things to loyalty. According to Marissa, they dragged Daniel's body together. Not far. Just beyond a shallow depression in the scrub. They didn't dig deep. Just enough to cover him quickly. She claimed Eric wrapped the tire iron in a shop rag and buried it separately. Then came the phone. She admitted she took the prepaid device and drove northbound on the highway. Fast. Heart pounding. She said she didn't know how far she drove, maybe 15, 20 miles, before tossing the phone out the window into darkness. The tower ping at 9:26 p.m. Highway speed. Moving north. It aligned. She returned home after midnight. Called Eric at 2:13 a.m. 18 minutes. They agreed on silence. 17 years of silence. When the prosecutor asked why she hadn't come forward sooner, her answer was simple. I was scared. Scared of prison. Scared of losing her future. Scared of being labeled a murderer. But fear doesn't exhume bodies. Bulldozers do. Eric Halden's defense team tore into her testimony the moment it leaked. They called her a liar. A self-preserving accomplice spinning a narrative to escape charges. They argued the partial DNA on the tire iron was inconclusive. Degraded. Contaminated by time. They questioned whether the burial site was truly the original location of the murder, or simply a disposal site. They suggested something darker. What if Marissa herself delivered the blow? The skull fracture, after all, could have been inflicted by someone shorter, striking upward from behind. Forensic analysis allowed for multiple interpretations. And Marissa had motive too: anger, jealousy, emotional volatility. Eric's attorneys painted a different sequence. One where Marissa orchestrated the meeting alone. One where she confronted Daniel privately. One where she struck him in rage. One where she later enlisted Eric's help in panic. 2 suspects. 2 narratives. 1 dead man. The prosecution charged Eric Halden with second-degree murder and conspiracy to conceal a body. Marissa, under her immunity agreement, faced charges related to obstruction of justice and evidence tampering, but not homicide. Laura Mercer sat through every hearing, eyes fixed forward. She listened to Marissa's testimony without blinking. She listened to Eric proclaim innocence with measured indignation. And somewhere between those competing versions of truth, Daniel's final moments hung suspended. The trial began in early 2021. 17 years after a screen door slammed. Prosecutors laid out the physical evidence, the soil match proving Daniel walked to the site alive. The prepaid phone purchased minutes after Marissa's debit card transaction. The tower data showing movement northbound consistent with her confession. The tire iron buried near the grave. The partial DNA linking Eric to the cloth. They called forensic experts to explain degradation patterns. They reconstructed the burial site in 3D modeling. They replayed the 34-second call, static crackling through the courtroom speakers. "Where are you?" The defense countered aggressively. They attacked Marissa's credibility. They emphasized the lack of full DNA confirmation. They highlighted the absence of eyewitnesses. They questioned whether one blow could cause death without immediate medical confirmation in 2001. They reminded the jury, circumstantial evidence can mislead. Then Eric took the stand. He denied striking Daniel. He admitted meeting that night, but claimed the confrontation ended with Daniel storming off on foot into the desert after an argument. He said he and Marissa left separately. He suggested Daniel might have encountered someone else later. A stranger. A predator. But under cross-examination, cracks appeared. "Why didn't you tell police in 2001 that you met him that night?" the prosecutor asked. Eric hesitated. "I was scared," he said. Scared of what? He couldn't answer cleanly. When shown the photograph of the tire iron, he looked away. When asked about the 2:13 a.m. phone call, he claimed they were discussing how to handle police questioning, not a body. The jury watched every flicker of expression. Every pause. 17 years of silence compressed into days of testimony. Closing arguments echoed through the courtroom like the desert wind once did through Daniel's open door. The prosecution described betrayal. Rage? A single impulsive act that destroyed a life and buried truth under sand. The defense described reasonable doubt. Inconsistent memory. The danger of convicting a man based on partial DNA and a co-conspirator's shifting story. The jury deliberated for 4 days. Laura Mercer did not sleep. When the verdict finally came, the courtroom felt smaller than ever. Eric Halden was found guilty of second-degree murder. Gasps rippled through the room. Eric closed his eyes. Marissa lowered her head. But justice does not rewind time. Daniel Mercer had been gone 17 years. His sister had aged through grief. His name had faded, resurfaced, and scarred the community twice over. The judge sentenced Eric to 25 years to life. Marissa received probation and community service for obstruction and evidence tampering. Some called it justice. Others called it imbalance. But as Laura stepped outside the courthouse into blinding Arizona sunlight, reporters shouted questions she barely heard. The desert wind carried dust across the pavement, just as it had on the night Daniel walked out of his house and never came back. The case that began as a whisper had ended in a conviction. And yet, even with a verdict, even with a weapon, even with testimony under oath, one truth remained chillingly fragile. The desert had kept its secret for 17 years. And it had almost succeeded. Conviction does not silence ghosts. The gavel fell. The sentence was read. 25 years to life. Cameras flashed. Headlines declared closure. Arizona 2001 disappearance cracked. Cold case ends with guilty verdict. The words sounded final, decisive, almost triumphant. But inside the Mercer family home, nothing felt resolved. Laura Mercer sat alone the night after sentencing, replaying Marissa's testimony in her mind, not the rehearsed portions, not the carefully structured timeline, but the hesitation. The way she said, "I didn't think he'd go that far." The way she described one single blow. One strike. Forensic experts had testified that a single blunt force trauma could cause rapid unconsciousness, even death, depending on angle and force. But they also admitted something quieter, something that barely made headlines. Daniel's skeletal remains showed faint microfracturing along two ribs inconsistent with the fall alone. Not definitive. Not dramatic. But present. The prosecution framed it as post-mortem shifting during burial. Defense suggested scavenger activity. No one pursued it aggressively, because the skull fracture was enough for conviction. But Laura heard it. Two ribs. And she remembered something else, Marissa's phrasing. He dropped. Not he fell forward. Not he collapsed. He dropped. Small linguistic details cling like thorns. Meanwhile, Eric Halden began the slow intake process into state prison. Orange uniform. Processing number. Cell assignment. He maintained innocence in his first interview from behind bars, insisting Marissa lied to save herself. He admitted being present at the argument, but denied touching the tire iron. She swung it, he told a prison interviewer months later. She did. The claim barely registered publicly. Convicted killers often redirect blame. But this time, it hit differently. Because forensic reanalysis, quietly conducted after sentencing due to a backlog review, revealed something new. The second partial DNA profile from the cloth around the tire iron, initially attributed statistically to Eric, had degraded further under additional testing. Advanced probabilistic modeling suggested the match was strong, but not exclusive. It could not rule out a close associate. A close associate like Marissa. The prosecution had emphasized alignment with Eric's sample. But the probability threshold, while compelling, wasn't absolute. Defense attorneys had argued this at trial, but the nuance drowned beneath emotional testimony. The case was legally closed. But scientifically, it wasn't airtight. In late 2022, Eric's appellate team filed a motion for post-conviction relief, citing evolving forensic interpretation standards. They argued the DNA evidence had been overstated. They requested re-examination under updated guidelines. Cold cases don't end cleanly. They splinter. The appellate court agreed to review the DNA findings, not the full conviction, just the evidentiary weight. Laura felt the floor tilt beneath her again. The thought of reopening courtrooms, rehashing testimony, hearing Daniel's name dissected once more, it felt like being dragged back into the desert at night. Marissa, meanwhile, had retreated into quiet suburban anonymity. She completed her probation, avoided interviews, deleted social media. But when news of the appeal surfaced, she reportedly contacted prosecutors immediately, asking whether her immunity agreement still protected her. Fear resurfaced fast. If the conviction weakened, the narrative shifted. And if the narrative shifted, so did liability. During appellate review, forensic experts clarified that the partial DNA mixture on the cloth could not conclusively exclude Marissa as a contributor. It also could not conclusively identify her. The sample was too degraded. But statistical phrasing used at trial, phrases like strongly consistent, were now scrutinized under stricter standards. Words matter. The tire iron still contained Daniel's blood. That was undisputed. But whose hands wrapped the cloth? Eric maintained that after Daniel was struck by Marissa, he claimed, he panicked and helped move the body, but never touched the weapon directly. He said she wrapped it, buried it. That he only assisted in covering Daniel. Marissa's testimony said the opposite. 2 survivors. 1 dead. No witnesses beyond them. Investigators revisited the rib fractures under updated forensic imaging. The pattern suggested possible compression, not from burial, but from weight applied during restraint. It was subtle. But it hinted at something more physical than a single surprise strike. What if Daniel didn't die instantly? What if there was a struggle? If so, Marissa's narrative of a sudden, singular blow might be incomplete, or deliberately minimized. The appellate court did not overturn the conviction. They ruled the DNA evidence, even under clarified interpretation, did not singularly determine guilt, rather, it supported a broader constellation of circumstantial proof, including Marissa's sworn testimony and Eric's admitted presence. The sentence stood. But doubt lingered like heat radiating from asphalt long after sunset. Laura visited the burial site alone one evening in 2023. The housing development now stood where scrub once grew. Paved roads. Identical homes. Children riding bicycles over what used to be silent desert. She parked near the edge of the cul-de-sac closest to where Daniel's remains were found. The wind still moved the same. She stood there imagining the final minutes, not as courtroom narrative, not as legal strategy, but as reality. Daniel stepping out of his truck. Seeing 2 familiar faces. Words escalating. Someone reaching into a trunk. Did he see it coming? Did he turn at the last second? Did he recognize betrayal in the fraction of a second before metal met bone? Conviction answers legal questions. It does not answer that. Over time, the case faded from headlines again. Eric settled into prison routine. Marissa avoided public scrutiny. Prosecutors moved on to new trials. But among locals, the story evolved into something more complicated than simple resolution. Some believed Eric acted alone in a fit of rage. Others believed Marissa manipulated both men, orchestrating a confrontation that spiraled. A smaller, darker theory suggested something neither side admitted, that Daniel may have been attacked by both, that panic bound them into a shared lie neither fully told. Because 17 years of silence shapes memory. And fear edits truth. Laura never fully embraced the word closure. She told a reporter once, quietly, closure is a myth. There's just knowing. She now knew who stood in the desert that night. She knew who helped bury her brother. But whether she knew the full truth, that remained uncertain. The prepaid phone was never recovered. No final recording exists of what happened after Daniel said, "Where are you?" The tire iron rests in an evidence vault, tagged and catalogued. The desert houses families now, laughter echoing over ground that once absorbed blood. And somewhere beneath layered testimony, legal phrasing, and microscopic fragments of degraded DNA, one final possibility lingers like wind over open land. That the story told in court was close enough to convict. But not complete enough to quiet the silence. Time doesn't settle a case. It just buries it under new noise. By 2024, the Mercer file sat in two places at once, archived in the county records system and alive in the minds of people who couldn't quite let it rest. Officially, the case was closed. Conviction secured. Appeals denied. Sentence upheld. Unofficially, it still breathed. The first crack came from an unlikely source, a podcast. A true crime series specializing in re-examined convictions, released a 4-part investigation dissecting the Daniel Mercer case. They didn't argue Eric Halden was innocent. They argued the narrative was incomplete. They replayed Marissa's grand jury testimony line by line. They slowed down audio from courtroom recordings, isolating tone shifts, pauses, the way she inhaled before describing the moment of impact. They brought in independent forensic analysts. One expert focused on the skull fracture trajectory. Based on digital modeling, he suggested the angle of the blow was slightly downward and lateral, consistent with someone standing to Daniel's right and slightly behind him. Eric was right-hand. So was Marissa. Not groundbreaking. But then came something more subtle. Soil disturbance patterns at the burial site, documented in 2018 during excavation, suggested two sets of drag impressions. Not one. The prosecution had argued both suspects dragged Daniel's body together. But the podcast's crime scene reconstruction expert pointed out asymmetry in the grooves. One track deeper than the other. One narrower. As if one person bore more weight. Or as if Daniel wasn't fully unconscious when he was moved. That detail ignited discussion online. Could he have still been alive when buried? The medical examiner had ruled the cause of death blunt force trauma. But without soft tissue, without organ analysis, absolute certainty was impossible. The depressed skull fracture could have rendered him unconscious, but not immediately dead. If Daniel Mercer had been breathing, barely, when dirt covered him, the case shifted from impulsive manslaughter to something colder. Something prolonged. The prosecution had not pursued that angle. It complicated the narrative. Introduced moral horror beyond the single strike story. Laura Mercer listened to the podcast alone in her kitchen. Each episode felt like reopening a wound she had finally learned to carry. But she didn't turn it off. Because if there was even a sliver of truth left undiscovered, she wanted it exposed. Meanwhile, Eric Halden granted an extended prison interview to the same podcast team. It was his first detailed public statement since conviction. He did not deny being present. He did not deny helping move Daniel. But he described the strike differently. He claimed Marissa swung first, during a heated exchange. Claimed Daniel turned toward her mid-argument. Claimed she grabbed the tire iron from his trunk, not his. Claimed she struck from the side, not behind. He admitted grabbing Daniel afterward, shaking him, trying to wake him. He said Daniel made a wet, choking sound. The host pressed him. Was he alive when you buried him? Eric's jaw tightened. I don't know, he said. Not no. Not absolutely not. I don't know. The statement rippled. Prosecutors dismissed the interview as revisionist desperation. Marissa's attorney labeled it deflection by a convicted murderer. But something in the details unsettled even seasoned investigators. Because in Marissa's original testimony, she said Daniel dropped immediately and never moved again. No choking sound. No attempt to breathe. 2 accounts. Both self-serving. Both partially incriminating. And between them, a possibility too dark to ignore. Forensic consultants hired independently by the podcast reviewed autopsy photographs again. They noted trace soil particulate within the nasal cavity and oral region of the skeletal remains. At the time, it had been attributed to environmental infiltration post-burial. But could it indicate inhalation? 17 years in desert soil makes conclusions treacherous. Decomposition, scavenging, and groundwater shifts contaminate evidence. Still, the possibility lingered. If Daniel inhaled soil while being buried, then the story told in court was sanitized. And if both suspects believed the other struck the fatal blow, perhaps neither fully acknowledged what happened in the panic that followed. The podcast uncovered another overlooked detail: tire tread impressions documented faintly near the burial site during 2018 excavation. At trial, they were deemed too degraded for pattern analysis. But archived high-resolution photographs still existed. An automotive forensics specialist re-examined them digitally. The partial tread suggested a mismatched pair of rear tires, one slightly more worn than the other. In 2001, Eric's Camry maintenance records, retrieved from an old auto shop database backup, showed a rear tire replacement 3 weeks before Daniel disappeared. One new tire. One older. Asymmetrical wear. It didn't prove who swung the tire iron. But it placed Eric's vehicle firmly at the burial site. Marissa, during a follow-up media statement prompted by the podcast's resurgence, reaffirmed her original testimony. She denied striking Daniel. Denied burying him alive. She insisted Eric delivered the blow, and insisted he was the one who decided not to call for help. She did not address the choking sound claim directly. Laura began to experience something unexpected, not doubt about guilt, but doubt about completeness. She no longer questioned whether Eric was responsible. She questioned whether the full truth had ever been spoken. Because fear in 2001 shaped every decision after. Fear of prison. Fear of exposure. Fear of being labeled complicit. In panic, people rewrite memory to survive it. And 17 years of repetition can turn revision into belief. The county prosecutor held a brief press conference in response to renewed attention. She stated the evidence supported the conviction, beyond reasonable doubt, and that no new physical findings altered the cause of death ruling. But she avoided one question. Could Daniel Mercer have been alive when buried? She declined to speculate. The burial site, now a landscaped corner near a row of identical houses, became a quiet pilgrimage point again. True crime followers left small tokens. Desert flowers. Handwritten notes. Residents grew uneasy. Homeowners association meetings grew tense. History refuses to stay paved over. In prison, Eric's appeals quieted. Legally, options narrowed. But interviews continued. In one recorded conversation, he said something almost lost in a longer rant. She told me not to call 911. She said we'd both go down. She said it was already too late. It contradicted her testimony. But it also implicated him equally. Two people standing over a fallen man. One blow. One choice not to seek help. That choice, more than the strike itself, echoed louder with each passing year. Laura visited Daniel's grave on the 23rd anniversary of his disappearance. The headstone bore his name, birth year, death year, 2001. Officially listed as homicide. She traced the engraved letters with her fingertips. She no longer wondered who did it. She wondered how long he lay there, under open sky, before breath left him. Because sometimes the most haunting part of a crime isn't the violence. It's the silence afterward. The silence where someone could have made a different call. The silence where headlights could have turned back. The silence where fear outweighed mercy. The desert had held Daniel Mercer for 17 years. The courtroom had held Eric Halden accountable. But the space between what happened and what was told, that space remained unsealed. And in that space, the wind still moved, restless, carrying questions no verdict could fully still. The desert keeps more than bones. It keeps doubt. After the podcast reignited the case, investigators, quietly, unofficially, reviewed everything again. Not to overturn a conviction. Not to chase headlines. But because unresolved variables itch at the back of a detective's mind like unfinished math. One question refused to die. If Daniel Mercer survived the initial blow, even briefly, why didn't either of them call for help? Because panic explains silence for minutes. Not for hours. And yet, according to phone records, neither Eric nor Marissa contacted emergency services that night. No anonymous tip. No delayed confession. Just an 18-minute call at 2:13 a.m. between the two of them. 18 minutes after midnight. 18 minutes to decide what story would live for the next 17 years. A forensic linguist, consulted during the renewed review, analyzed both of their testimonies using statement validity assessment techniques. Patterns emerged. Marissa's account contained sensory detail during the argument, dust in the air, Daniel's voice rising, but grew vague during the burial. Eric's later prison interviews were detailed about physical contact, shaking Daniel, rolling him over, but blurred around the exact moment of impact. Both sharpened memory where it helped them. Both fogged it where it didn't. Meanwhile, something else surfaced from 2001 records that had never drawn attention before. A 911 hang-up call placed at 9:41 p.m. from a payphone located off Highway 17, roughly 12 miles north of the burial site. At the time, it was logged and dismissed. No voice. Just static. Caller disconnected before speaking. Thousands of such calls occur annually. It meant nothing. Until someone overlaid the timeline again. The prepaid phone pinged northbound at 9:26 p.m. Marissa claimed she drove north, threw the phone from her window and went home. But the hang-up call at 9:41 p.m. came from the direction she would have traveled. Could she have stopped? Could she have hesitated? Could she have dialed 911 from a payphone, then panicked and hung up? Investigators could not trace the call beyond location. Payphones in 2001 did not log identity. No surveillance footage survived. No witnesses recalled a woman stopping there that night. But the timing was close enough to sting. When confronted during a private follow-up interview years after the trial, Marissa denied ever using a payphone that night. She insisted she drove straight home. Eric, when asked separately in prison, said something different. She almost called, he muttered during a recorded conversation. She pulled over. Pulled over. The words landed hard. If true, it meant there was a moment, however brief, where the outcome might have changed. Another layer complicated the narrative further. Weather reports from September 14, 2001 indicated a brief temperature drop after sunset, and wind gusts up to 22 miles per hour. Blowing sand. Reduced visibility. If Daniel had been unconscious, but breathing when buried, wind could have accelerated oxygen deprivation once soil covered his face. The medical examiner's original conclusion, death by blunt force trauma, remained the official cause. But without soft tissue, suffocation could neither be confirmed nor excluded. The uncertainty gnawed. Laura read every update, every reanalysis. She no longer sought revenge. She sought clarity. She asked prosecutors whether the case could ever be reclassified if new forensic interpretation suggested burial while alive. They answered carefully, legally, the conviction stands. Further nuance would not alter the sentence. Justice is a fixed number of years. Truth is not. The neighborhood built over the burial site held its own quiet tension. Homeowners whispered about resale values. Parents worried about children digging in backyards. A small memorial plaque appeared briefly near the edge of the development, unofficial, installed overnight by someone unknown. It read simply, "He was here." It was removed within days. But the message lingered. In prison, Eric's demeanor shifted over time. The anger softened into something more ambiguous. In one letter to a relative, later shared anonymously, he wrote, "We both made choices that night. Some choices don't let you sleep again. We both. Not she. Not I. We." Marissa, contacted repeatedly by journalists, eventually issued a single written statement through her attorney. "I regret not coming forward sooner. I regret not calling for help. I live with that every day. Not I regret what he did. Not I regret the accident. I regret not calling for help." The omission roared louder than any admission. 17 years of silence had already shaped the legal outcome. But emotionally, morally, the terrain was still unstable. Then, in early 2025, a former co-worker from the auto shop came forward with a detail no one had disclosed before. He claimed that weeks before Daniel disappeared, Eric had shown him a tire iron with a chipped edge, joking that it could crack a skull. At the time, it was gallows humor between mechanics. Now it sounded prophetic. Investigators verified that the recovered tire iron had a subtle flattened imperfection near its striking end, consistent with impact against bone. The co-worker admitted he hadn't reported the comment earlier, because he hadn't remembered it until hearing the podcast years later. Memory is unreliable. But sometimes it surfaces too late. Prosecutors reviewed the statement. It reinforced their case, but did not materially change the conviction. Still, the cumulative weight of these fragments, the hang-up call, the choking sound, the soil in nasal cavities, the ambiguous DNA probabilities, the shared silence, formed a mosaic more complex than the courtroom version ever allowed. Laura returned once more to the edge of the development at dusk. Children's laughter carried faintly across trimmed lawns. Streetlights flickered on where desert once lay untouched. She imagined Daniel's last view. Open sky streaked with fading orange. Two figures standing over him. A choice suspended in that twilight, call for help or cover it up. That choice defined everything that followed. The legal system closed the file. But the human story remained jagged. Because even when a disappearance is cracked, even when a weapon is found, even when a verdict is delivered, there are still seconds no one can fully reconstruct. Seconds between impact and silence. Seconds between dialing and hanging up. Seconds where fear wins. And in those seconds, a life ended, not just from a blow of metal, but from the absence of mercy. The desert never testified. It never needed to. It held the truth long enough for humans to bury themselves with it. Years passed. Appeals were filed, reviewed, denied. The legal machinery that once moved with urgency now turned with ritual precision. Motions cited ineffective counsel. They cited evidentiary weight. They cited the ambiguity of forensic interpretation in early 2000s investigations. None of it cracked the verdict. But something else began to fracture. Eric Mercer's health. By 2028, nearly 3 decades into his sentence, prison medical records noted a progressive neurological disorder. Tremors. Muscle rigidity. Slurred speech. The kind of decline that forces a man to sit alone longer than the court ever intended. Illness does something prison cannot. It removes the illusion of time. In an interview granted to a regional documentary crew, filmed inside the facility under strict supervision, Eric appeared thinner, slower, and less defiant than the man jurors once watched. When asked directly whether Daniel Mercer had been alive when buried, he did not answer immediately. He closed his eyes and counted, almost imperceptibly. 1, 2, 3. The reporter waited. I don't know, Eric said finally. I told myself he wasn't. I had to. Had to. That phrasing lodged itself in the public consciousness. Because telling yourself something is not the same as knowing it. Across the state, Marissa Hale lived under a different kind of confinement, one without walls but heavy with routine avoidance. She had changed jobs twice. Moved cities once. Avoided interviews. Avoided anniversaries. Avoided Highway 17. But in late 2029, something shifted. A civil wrongful death lawsuit, filed by Daniel's mother years earlier, but stalled during criminal proceedings, reached a settlement phase. Depositions were required. Under oath, in a quiet conference room rather than a courtroom, Marissa was asked again. When you drove north that night, did you believe Daniel Mercer was alive? The court reporter later described a pause so long it felt procedural. Yes, Marissa said. The word detonated. Not in a headline. Not in a courtroom gasp. But in the sterile hum of fluorescent lighting. She elaborated only slightly. I thought he might be. Might be. That uncertainty was everything. Because criminal law requires proof beyond reasonable doubt. But conscience operates on something far less precise. Her admission did not change Eric's sentence. It did not reopen the conviction. The statute of limitations and plea agreements bound certain aspects of liability. Prosecutors reviewed the deposition transcript, but concluded there was insufficient new evidence to pursue additional charges without risking collapse of the existing judgment. Justice, once codified, resists revision. Laura Mercer read the deposition transcript 3 times. Not because it gave her closure, but because it confirmed what she had always suspected. There had been a window. A window where someone believed her son might still be breathing. And chose not to act. In the following months, Eric requested a private meeting with a prison chaplain. Portions of their conversations later surfaced in court filings connected to his medical parole request. He described the burial in greater detail than ever before. He said Daniel made a sound. Not a word. A sound. Like air trying to get past dirt, he explained. He said he froze. He said Marissa told him it was reflex. He said he wanted to believe her. And so he did. Memory is elastic under pressure. Experts debated whether his recollection had evolved from guilt or reality. Trauma reshapes narratives. Suggestion influences recall. Years of hearing speculation can plant images that feel authentic. But one fact stood immutable. Daniel Mercer died in a shallow grave. Whether by impact or suffocation, the result was the same. Yet the manner, the sequence, mattered deeply to those left behind. Public opinion shifted subtly after Marissa's deposition became public record. Commentators no longer framed her solely as a coerced participant. The 18-minute phone call resurfaced in analysis. So did the 911 hang-up. Podcasts revisited the timeline. Legal scholars debated whether reckless indifference could have supported a different charge in 2003. It was academic now, but emotionally explosive. In 2030, Laura installed a permanent memorial bench overlooking a desert preserve not far from where Daniel's body had been found. The development had expanded, but a strip of protected land remained untouched. The plaque read, Daniel Mercer, 1981 to 2001. He deserved a call for help. Simple, precise, unforgiving. Marissa saw a photograph of the bench online. She did not comment publicly. But within a year, she submitted a written statement to a restorative justice program, one that facilitates dialogue between victims' families and offenders. She requested a mediated meeting with Laura. Laura declined. Not out of hatred. Out of exhaustion. Some conversations reopen wounds without closing them. Eric's medical parole hearing concluded in 2031. Prosecutors opposed release, citing the severity of the crime and the lingering uncertainty surrounding Daniel's final moments. The parole board denied the request. In their written decision, one sentence stood out. The board finds that the applicant has yet to provide a fully consistent account of the victim's condition at the time of burial. Consistency. The very thing memory struggles to maintain over decades. Inside his cell, Eric reportedly wept after reading the denial. Not loudly. Just once. By then, the case had transformed from a whodunit into something more unsettling. A why didn't they? Why didn't they call? Why didn't they stop? Why didn't one of them choose differently in those suspended seconds between panic and permanence? Because most crimes are not born from elaborate schemes. They are born from fear. From pride. From the instinct to protect oneself at any cost. Daniel Mercer's story had once been about disappearance. Then it became about discovery. Now it lingered as something harder to categorize, a study in moral hesitation. A demonstration that sometimes the dead are not only victims of violence. They are victims of delay. And delay can be just as lethal as intent. As the sun sets over the desert each evening, wind still moves across that preserved strip of land. It erases footprints almost instantly. But not history. History remains, etched not in sand, but in the seconds no one can take back. By the time the case entered its fourth decade, it no longer felt like a headline. It felt like a cautionary tale. True crime cycles are predictable. Shock. Obsession. Debate. Fatigue. Replacement. But Daniel Mercer's story refused to fade completely, because it never rested comfortably in a single category. It wasn't a serial killer saga. It wasn't an unsolved mystery. It wasn't even a clear-cut murder in the public imagination. It was something more disturbing. A death that might have been prevented. In 2033, a university ethics department built an entire seminar around the case. Students analyzed the timeline. They dissected the 18-minute phone call. They argued over Marissa's deposition. They debated Eric's evolving statements. The professor posed one central question. At what point does inaction become violence? There was no consensus. Some argued the fatal act was the blow itself. Others insisted the moral point of no return occurred when they chose burial over emergency services. A few focused on the psychological freeze response, How shock can narrow cognition and distort decision-making. But one detail consistently silenced the room. The possibility of breathing under soil. Forensic pathologists invited to lecture explained how shallow burial interacts with oxygen deprivation. They described how panic compounds poor judgment. They clarified that without soft tissue evidence, certainty is impossible. Medicine can estimate, one expert said. It cannot resurrect the moment. Meanwhile, Laura Mercer aged in quiet dignity. Grief, once volcanic, had cooled into something steadier. She no longer followed every article. She stopped listening to the podcasts that once amplified her son's name. Instead, she volunteered with families navigating fresh disappearances. She understood the waiting. She understood the oscillation between hope and dread. She understood how uncertainty corrodes sleep. During one support group session, a mother asked her the question people had whispered for years. Do you think he suffered? Laura inhaled and answered with brutal honesty. I think someone had a chance to help him. It was the closest she ever came to articulating what haunted her most. Not rage. Not vengeance. But the existence of a choice. In 2035, Eric Mercer suffered a severe medical episode that left him partially paralyzed. He was transferred to a prison infirmary wing designed for long-term care. Reporters briefly revisited the case when his condition became public, speculating whether compassionate release would surface again. It did. And once more, it was denied. The board cited the same issue, incomplete acknowledgement of responsibility. In their closing statement, they wrote, accountability requires clarity. Clarity, the one commodity this case never fully achieved. Marissa, by contrast, lived in anonymity. She did not reoffend. She did not seek publicity. She avoided public commentary. Records show she maintained steady employment and minimal legal trouble. But anonymity is not absolution. Those who knew her described an almost ritualistic avoidance of conflict. As if any raised voice might rewind her to a desert night thick with dust and consequence. In 2038, a final documentary revisited the case, not for sensationalism, but reflection. It concluded not with reenactments, but with silence. A static shot of the preserved desert strip at dusk. Wind audible. No narration for a full 30 seconds. Because sometimes the absence of sound says more than a scripted conclusion. The closing words were simple. Some tragedies are measured not only by what was done, but by what was not. Laura attended a private screening. When it ended, she remained seated long after the credits stopped. A producer gently asked if she wished to say anything for the record. She shook her head. Then paused. Tell people, she said finally, that panic passes. But what you do during it stays. That sentence circulated far beyond the documentary's audience. It became quoted in ethics essays. Referenced in law review articles. Shared quietly among first responders. Panic passes. But what you do during it stays. Daniel Mercer's grave is no longer shallow. His remains were relocated to a family plot years ago. The desert holds no marker now. The housing development stands complete. Children ride bicycles where investigators once walked grid patterns. Life continues. It always does. But beneath ordinary routines lies an invisible architecture of choices, thousands made daily without consequence. And occasionally, one made under pressure that reshapes everything. The law categorized Daniel's death. The courts processed it. The system delivered its sentence. But the deeper lesson lingered outside statutes. It lived in the fragile space between fear and responsibility. Between dialing and disconnecting. Between burying truth and facing it. And long after the transcripts gather dust, long after the headlines dissolve into digital archives, the case endures as a reminder. Mercy is a decision. So is silence. On a warm September evening each year, Laura lights a candle on her porch. Not because she believes it changes anything. Not because it signals forgiveness. But because light, however small, stands in opposition to the darkness of hesitation. The desert wind still moves miles away. It erases footprints. It shifts sand. But it cannot erase the knowledge that, once upon a night, someone could have picked up a phone. And didn't. And in that space between impulse and action, a life was lost, and 3 others were permanently defined by the seconds they chose not to reclaim. Time did what time always does. It thinned the headlines. It aged the photographs. It softened the sharpest edges of public outrage. But it did not dissolve the question. By 2042, Daniel Mercer's case had become required reading in several criminal justice programs. Not because it was the most brutal. Not because it was the most complex. But because it sat in that unsettling gray space between intent and omission. Students no longer debated who did it. They debated something more uncomfortable. Would I have acted differently? The 18-minute phone call was now archived, legally sealed but academically dissected. Its duration had become symbolic, long enough to deliberate, short enough to panic. Professors projected a blank slide that simply read 6 p.m. and asked their students to sit in silence for that exact amount of time. No one ever lasted without shifting. Because 18 minutes is an eternity when you know something irreversible is unfolding. In 2044, Eric Mercer died in custody. Complications related to his neurological illness ended the slow unraveling that prison had stretched across decades. His final recorded statement, taken by a chaplain days before his death, was brief. I should have called. No elaboration. No reframing. No blame. Just that. The statement was released publicly after his passing. Commentators argued over whether it constituted confession, remorse, or simple regret for consequences. Laura read it once. Then closed the document. She did not attend the burial. Closure had never arrived through courtrooms. It wasn't going to arrive through a graveside admission. Marissa Hale remained alive. And silent. 4 years after Eric's death, speculation swirled. Would she speak now that he could no longer contradict her? Would she publish a memoir? Give an interview? Seek forgiveness? She did none of it. Instead, in 2046, an unexpected development surfaced, not from media, not from lawyers, but from a small non-profit restorative justice archive. Marissa had submitted a sealed letter to be released only after her own death. Its contents were not immediately public. But its existence was. That alone reignited curiosity. Why wait? Why delay truth yet again? Laura declined to comment when asked about the letter. Age had slowed her movements, but sharpened her clarity. When pressed by a reporter outside her home, she answered calmly. Some truths are written for the writer, not the reader. It was the last on-record statement she ever gave about the case. In 2049, Laura Mercer passed away peacefully in her sleep. Her obituary mentioned Daniel by name. It mentioned her advocacy work. It did not mention the trial. At her memorial service, one of the families she had supported stood and spoke. She taught us, the woman said, voice trembling, that even when you don't get the ending you want, you still choose who you become after. That line traveled further than any courtroom transcript ever had. Because in the end, Daniel's story was no longer solely about a death in the desert. It was about divergence. Two young adults faced a moment of crisis. They chose concealment. Laura faced decades of aftermath. She chose endurance. In 2051, Marissa Hale died unexpectedly of natural causes. Within weeks, the sealed letter was unarchived. It was 12 pages long. There were no dramatic revelations of premeditated murder. No hidden accomplices. No conspiracy unraveled. Instead, it confirmed something far more human and more devastating. She wrote that when Daniel made the sound under the dirt, she knew. Not definitively. Not medically. But instinctively. She described the air that night as cold against her throat. She described Eric's shaking hands. She described fear, not of prison, not of scandal, but of watching someone die and being responsible. I told myself it was reflex, she wrote. But I knew reflexes don't sound like that. She admitted she dialed 911 from the payphone. And hung up when the operator answered. I heard a voice say, "What's your emergency?" she wrote. And I couldn't form the words. She ended the letter with a sentence that historians would later quote in ethics textbooks. Silence felt safer than truth for 18 minutes. I have lived inside that 18 minutes ever since. There it was. Not a legal reversal. Not a new charge. But confirmation. Daniel Mercer may have died from blunt force trauma. Or suffocation. Or a combination of both. Forensics would never untangle it completely. But morally, there had been awareness. There had been opportunity. And there had been withdrawal. The public reaction to the letter was muted compared to the original trial decades earlier. Outrage had aged. The principles were gone. The desert had long since transformed into suburbia. But in classrooms, in law schools, in emergency response training seminars, the case found new relevance. Not as spectacle, but as warning. Because the story's power was never in its violence. It was in its hesitation. Today, if you stand near the preserved strip of desert land where Daniel was once found, you will not see a marker. You will see wind moving across open space. You will see children playing in the distance. You will see ordinary life proceeding, unaware of the moral fault line beneath it. History does not announce itself in those places. It waits quietly. Daniel Mercer's name survives in archived transcripts, in academic papers, in a memorial bench that still